The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting golden hues across the tranquil waters of a secluded island paradise. Gentle waves lapped against the shore, a rhythmic melody that blended seamlessly with the rustling of palm trees in the soft ocean breeze. It was the kind of place people only dreamed about, a private sanctuary where worries melted away, leaving only the promise of serenity and romance. For Christe, it was a dream come true. Standing on the wooden deck of their luxurious beachfront villa, she inhaled deeply, letting the salty air fill her lungs. The trip had been nothing short of magical so far. Every detail, from the candlelit dinners to the breathtaking views, felt like it had been plucked straight from a fairy tale. And why wouldn't it? This was her honeymoon, a time meant for love, laughter, and the beginning of a lifetime together. Inside the villa, soft music played from a hidden speaker system, mingling with the occasional chirp of tropical birds. Everything about this place was designed for indulgence. The plush, king-size bed draped in sheer white curtains, the infinity pool glistening under the moonlight, the champagne chilling in a silver bucket by the bedside. It was the kind of luxury that made reality feel distant, like nothing outside these shores could touch them. Christy turned to her husband, Bradley Dawson, who stood at the edge of the pool, gazing out at the ocean. He looked relaxed, his broad shoulders slightly slumped, his hands resting on the cool stone railing. The gentle flicker of tiki torches illuminated his face, casting shadows that danced across his features. "Can you believe we're actually here?" she asked, stepping closer to him. "It still feels unreal." Bradley turned to her with a slow smile, his dark eyes unreadable in the dim light. "Yeah," he said, his voice soft. "It's something else, isn't it?" There was a strange edge to his tone, something distant, almost distracted, but Christe brushed it off. Maybe it was just the exhaustion from traveling, or maybe the weight of everything finally settling in. She wanted to believe it was nothing. She slipped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest. "This is everything I ever wanted," she whispered. "Just the two of us, away from everything." Bradley hesitated for the briefest of moments before wrapping his arms around her. His embrace felt warm, familiar, comforting. Yet beneath the surface there was something else, a tension she couldn't quite place. "You make everything perfect," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Christa smiled, allowing herself to sink into the moment. She had spent her life waiting for something like this, for a love that felt safe, for a future that felt secure, and yet somewhere deep inside her, an unspoken fear coiled tightly, a feeling she couldn't quite explain. The night stretched on, filled with soft laughter, the clinking of glasses, and stolen kisses beneath the moonlight. But as the hours passed, a shift began to take place. Subtle at first, then more pronounced. A flicker of something in Bradley's gaze, a stiffness in his movements. Christa tried to ignore it, to pretend that nothing was wrong. But the weight of the air between them grew heavier, suffocating. By the time they retreated inside, the perfect honeymoon she had envisioned no longer felt quite so perfect. And as she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that somewhere in the darkness, a storm was already brewing. The early morning sun painted streaks of gold across the horizon, casting a quiet glow over the secluded island. The waves lapped lazily at the shore, whispering secrets only the ocean could understand. Inside the villa, the remnants of the previous night still lingered. An empty wine bottle tipped over on the table, a silk robe draped across a chair, the scent of tropical flowers mixed with the salt of the sea. But something else hung in the air, something far less tangible, a tension, thick and unspoken. Christa stirred beneath the sheets, her mind caught in the haze between sleep and waking. A dull ache pressed at her temples, the result of too much wine, or maybe something less obvious, something she didn't want to name. The night had unraveled in ways she hadn't expected. What started as an intimate evening had shifted into something different, something uncomfortable. Bradley had grown quiet, withdrawn. His laughter had been slower, his touch different, not cold, not cruel, but somehow absent. She had felt it in the way he looked at her, or rather, the way he didn't. There had been a weight behind his silence, a lingering frustration beneath his words. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was overthinking things. But in the quiet moments when the world fell still, she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling creeping along the edges of her mind. The bed beside her was empty, the sheets still warm. She sat up, rubbing her hands over her face before glancing toward the open balcony. The curtains billowed softly in the morning breeze, revealing glimpses of the world beyond. The rolling waves, the untouched sand, the endless blue stretching far beyond the horizon. But there was no sign of Bradley. A flicker of unease curled in her stomach. She pushed it down, reminding herself that this was supposed to be a paradise, a retreat from reality. They were here to celebrate their future together, not to dwell on fleeting moments of doubt. Slipping out of bed, she wrapped a light robe around herself and stepped onto the balcony. The island was still, the resort eerily quiet in the early morning. Beyond the villa, the winding paths leading to the water were empty, the beach untouched. Her gaze drifted toward the shoreline, where the tide had receded slightly, leaving patterns in the damp sand. And then she saw him. Bradley stood near the water's edge, his back to her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His posture was rigid, shoulders hunched in a way that didn't fit the relaxed setting. The image struck her as oddly out of place, like a crack in a perfect painting. Something was wrong. She hesitated before calling out to him, but the wind carried her voice away, leaving only silence in its wake. He didn't move, didn't turn, just stood there staring out at the ocean as if searching for something he couldn't find. A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air crept along her spine. She told herself it was nothing, that it was just her imagination, but deep down she knew better. The air inside the villa felt colder than it should have, not from the ocean breeze slipping through the open balcony doors, but from something deeper, something unspoken. Christe could still see Bradley standing by the water's edge, unmoving, locked in place by thoughts she couldn't hear. She watched him for a moment longer, hoping he would turn, acknowledge her presence, offer even a sliver of reassurance, but he didn't. A quiet unease settled in her chest as she stepped back inside. The villa felt too still, as if it were holding its breath. She wandered toward the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face, trying to shake the lingering sense of dread that had clung to her since waking. Maybe she was imagining things. Maybe she was reading too much into his mood, letting her mind twist small details into something sinister. But then she noticed it, a suitcase, packed, sitting by the door. Her stomach tightened. Christe approached slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the luggage. It was his, half-zipped, with neatly folded clothes peeking out. His toiletries bag, his travel documents. It wasn't packed in haste, no, this had been planned. Her pulse quickened. She turned back toward the balcony, but Bradley was gone. Panic flared through her veins as she hurried outside, scanning the shoreline. The waves rolled in and out, indifferent to her growing fear. There was no sign of him, no footprints leading away, no lingering shadow of his presence. She swallowed hard. Her first instinct was to call out, to demand an explanation, but something, some primal instinct buried deep in her gut, told her to wait, to think, to not assume that everything was what it seemed. She turned back inside, forcing herself to breathe. The villa, once a place of luxury and comfort, now felt like a stranger's home. The walls seemed to press in, the silence more oppressive than the humid air outside. Then her gaze fell upon the bedside table, Bradley's wedding band. It lay there, gleaming in the soft morning light. Left behind, a lump formed in her throat as her mind scrambled for an explanation, but none came. A packed suitcase, a missing fiancé, a discarded wedding band. The pieces weren't fitting together, and yet deep down, some part of her already knew. Something had gone terribly wrong, and it was only the beginning. The minutes crawled by as Christe stood frozen in place, staring at the ring on the bedside table. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach, but she forced herself to move. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the band, turning it over in her palm. The weight of it was heavier than it should have been, as if it carried a truth she wasn't ready to face. Bradley wouldn't have left this behind, at least not unless he meant for her to find it. Her breath hitched. The villa, once filled with the quiet hum of their shared routine, now felt abandoned, like the remnants of a life that had suddenly vanished. She tried to push away the growing panic, but the signs were too clear. The suitcase, the missing fiancé, the ring. None of it made sense, and yet it did. Something was very, very wrong. Forcing herself to think, she reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over Bradley's name in her call log. She pressed it, bringing the phone to her ear. The dial tone rang once, twice, then, straight to voicemail. Her heart pounded. She tried again. Nothing. The walls of the villa seemed to close in as 1,000 questions crashed into her mind at once. Had he left on his own? Had something happened to him? Was she looking at the beginning of a carefully planned disappearance? Or something worse? Christe's pulse raced as she grabbed a sweater and her keys before stepping out onto the villa's deck. The morning sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the sand. She scanned the beach, searching for anything, anyone, but it was empty. Just the endless stretch of coastline and the whisper of the tide. Her mind whirred, trying to retrace their last conversation, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. Bradley had been distant the night before, quieter than usual. But was it anything more than exhaustion? Had she missed something? She needed answers. Turning on her heel, she hurried back inside, her hands shaking as she rifled through the packed suitcase. Clothes, toiletries, a few personal items. But then she noticed something odd. His passport was still inside. A sharp chill ran through her. Bradley wouldn't have left the country without it. So where was he? And why did it feel like he had disappeared without a trace? Christe's breath came in shallow bursts as she stared at the passport in her trembling hands. The villa was quiet. Too quiet. The sound of the waves outside, once a soothing backdrop to her mornings, now felt like an eerie whisper, a reminder of the empty space beside her. Her mind raced. If Bradley's passport was still here, then he couldn't have left the country. But where was he? And why had he left behind the one thing that would have ensured his return? Swallowing her panic, she forced herself to think rationally. The suitcase was packed neatly. Too neatly. Bradley wasn't a meticulous packer. He always stuffed his clothes in haphazardly, claiming he'd deal with it later. But this was careful, intentional. Did he pack it himself? Or had someone else done it for him? The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. Christe's fingers hovered over her phone again, her mind warring between instinct and logic. She tried calling Bradley once more. Straight to voicemail. She sent a text. Christe. Bradley, where are you? This isn't funny. Call me now. The message sat undelivered. Her stomach tightened. She needed to retrace his steps. Christe grabbed her purse, slipped into her sandals, and rushed out the door. The tropical air was thick with heat as she stepped onto the stone pathway, leading away from the villa. She forced herself to focus, to think of the last time she had seen Bradley. Last night, they had gone to dinner, a quiet restaurant dimly lit, overlooking the beach. Bradley had been distracted, his phone screen casting a glow over his face as he read messages she couldn't see. When she asked about it, he brushed it off. Work, he had said, forcing a smile. Nothing important. She should have pressed him further. Christe made her way down the narrow street toward the resort's front desk, her sandals slapping against the pavement. A concierge in a crisp uniform stood behind the counter, smiling politely as she approached. Hi, excuse me, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I'm looking for my fiancé, Bradley. Have you seen him this morning? The concierge's expression shifted slightly. Just a flicker of something, uncertainty, hesitation, before his polite mask returned. I'm not sure, miss. Do you know if he had any plans today? She swallowed. But his things are still in our villa, his passport, and his phone goes straight to voicemail. The concierge frowned. That is strange. Let me check something. He turned to his computer, typing quickly. Christe held her breath. His name? Bradley. She hesitated, then added, Bradley Sanders. The concierge's fingers froze over the keyboard. A pause. Then carefully he said, It looks like Mr. Sanders checked out early this morning. Christe's heart stopped. That's not possible. His things are still in our room. The concierge's frown deepened. I, I can check again, but our system shows that he checked out at 5:45 a.m. The time hit her like a slap. 5:45 a.m. While she had been asleep, her mind reeled. If Bradley had checked out, then why was all his stuff still in the room? Why hadn't he told her? And more importantly, where the hell had he gone? She clenched her fists, trying to stay calm. There had to be an explanation. Maybe a mistake in the system. Maybe, I need to see the security footage, she blurted. The concierge's eyes widened. I'm afraid that's not. I'm his fiancée. If he left at 5:45 a.m., then someone had to see him. There has to be a record. The man hesitated, looking unsure. Please, she pressed, her voice thick with desperation. I just want to know if he's okay. A beat. Then reluctantly the concierge sighed. Let me speak to my manager. Christe stepped back, her pulse hammering. Her world felt like it was slipping out from under her. None of this made sense. Bradley was gone. His things were here. The hotel claimed he checked out, but something wasn't adding up. And for the first time, a terrifying thought clawed its way to the surface. Had Bradley disappeared on his own, or had something happened to him before he even got the chance? The air inside the security office was heavy with the hum of old monitors and the faint scent of stale coffee. Christe sat on the edge of a worn-out chair, her fingernails digging into her palm as the resort manager, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, queued up the surveillance footage. We normally don't show guest security footage, he said, glancing at her. But given the circumstances, we'll make an exception. You said Bradley checked out at 5:45 a.m., correct? Christe nodded, her throat tight. The manager clicked through the system, fast-forwarding through the early morning hours. The grainy footage showed the resort's lobby bathed in dim lighting. A few employees moved in and out of frame, but no sign of Bradley. There, the manager muttered, pausing the video. Christe's stomach twisted. A figure had appeared on the screen, walking toward the reception desk. Her breath caught in her throat. It was not Bradley. The man was about the same height, dressed in dark clothing, his head slightly lowered as he approached the counter. The camera's angle obscured his face. He leaned in, spoke to the receptionist, and after a brief exchange, turned toward the exit. Christe's eyes widened. That's not him, she whispered. That's not Bradley. The manager frowned. Are you sure? Positive. I know how he moves, how he stands. That's not him. The words felt foreign in her own mouth, like she was trying to convince herself this was really happening. The receptionist on the video handed over what appeared to be a room key or some sort of document. The man nodded, then strode out of the hotel without hesitation. Christe's pulse pounded in her ears. Who is that? She asked. The manager's face darkened. I don't know. Christe's head swam. Someone had checked out of the hotel using Bradley's name. Someone had pretended to be him. But why? And where was Bradley? Her voice came out hoarse. Can you rewind? Show me the moment he arrived? The manager nodded and reversed the footage. The screen flickered as time rewound. There, the same man appeared at the entrance, his posture stiff, as if he were on a mission. He walked in at exactly 5:37 a.m. Christe's pulse quickened. He didn't come from a guest room. He came from outside. Can you zoom in? The manager hesitated. It'll be blurry, but I'll try. The footage adjusted, pixelating as the camera zoomed in on the man's face. His features were indistinct, blurred by the low quality, but Christe could make out something unsettling. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. Something in her gut screamed that this was deliberate. Whoever he was, he didn't want to be seen. Christe's hands turned cold. Do you recognize him? The manager asked. She shook her head slowly, but a different thought gnawed at her. Someone had stolen Bradley's identity, but had they stolen more than that? Her mind raced. If Bradley was still alive, where was he? And if he wasn't? Her stomach lurched. I need to talk to the police. Christe sat rigid in the back of the police cruiser, the dull hum of the engine filling the silence between her and the officer at the wheel. The resort had called law enforcement after she insisted there was something deeply wrong with Bradley's disappearance. Now the pit in her stomach only deepened as they approached the local precinct. Detective Marcus Hanley, a man in his late 40s with sharp eyes and a slow, deliberate manner, met her at the station. He led her into a small windowless room where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A cup of untouched coffee sat on the table, a faint ring of moisture around its base. Christe tried to steady her hands. "You're saying the man who checked out of the resort wasn't your husband?" Hanley asked, leaning back in his chair. "I know it wasn't him," Christe said. "I watched the security footage myself. The man who left under Bradley's name, it wasn't him." Hanley exhaled through his nose, studying her. "And you're certain Bradley didn't just leave on his own? Maybe he had a reason to." Krista's hands balled into fists. "He wouldn't do that." Hanley held her gaze, then nodded slightly. He slid a notepad closer. "What can you tell me about Bradley?" Christe hesitated, the memories of their life together flashing before her. Dinners at home, vacations, quiet moments where they just existed together. She described him in detail, his habits, his mannerisms, his schedule. Hanley listened, jotting down notes. Then he shut the notepad. "We'll look into it," he said. Christe didn't know what she expected. Maybe urgency, maybe alarm. Instead, the detective's demeanor remained infuriatingly neutral. She left the station feeling unsettled. Hours passed in a blur of exhaustion. Christe found herself at a small diner, staring blankly at a cup of coffee she didn't want. She barely noticed the television mounted in the corner, the news droning on about local events. Then, a single sentence cut through the haze. "Authorities are investigating the discovery of a body in the river early this morning." Krista's blood turned to ice. Her head snapped up, her breath catching in her throat. The news anchor continued, her expression somber. "An unidentified male, found near the rocks. Authorities are asking for the public's help in identifying the victim." Christie's hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone. She dialed Detective Hanley's number with fingers that barely obeyed her. He picked up after 3 rings. "This is Hanley." "Where?" Christie demanded, her voice shaking. "The body in the river. Where was it found?" There was a pause. Then Hanley's voice came, quiet and measured. "We don't know if it's your husband, Mrs. Krupe." Tears blurred her vision. "But you don't know that it's not." The silence on the other end confirmed her worst fears. The crime scene was chaotic. Yellow tape sectioned off the riverbank, officers moving in coordinated precision. Christe's stomach churned as she approached, her breath uneven. Hanley met her at the perimeter. His expression was unreadable. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I do." He hesitated, then signaled to an officer. A body bag lay on the ground, its shape unmistakable. Krista's pulse thundered in her ears as the zipper was slowly pulled down. Her breath caught. The man inside was bloated from the water, his skin pallid, his features swollen beyond recognition. But his hair, his build. Christe staggered backward. "It's not him," she whispered. "That's not Bradley." She expected relief. Instead, a deeper dread clawed its way into her chest. Because if that wasn't Bradley, where the hell was he? Detective Reynolds sat in his car, the rhythmic drumming of rain against the windshield matching the unsettled tempo of his thoughts. The case was unraveling, but not in the way he had expected. The initial assumption that this was a straightforward crime of passion was slipping through his fingers like fine sand. Every lead peeled back another layer of deception, revealing a calculated plot rather than a spontaneous act of violence. Back at the station, the evidence board was cluttered with photographs, financial records, and forensic reports. At the center was a picture of Bianca, her eyes frozen in time, brimming with life that had been cruelly extinguished. To her right was Larry's mugshot, his face unreadable, caught between defiance and something darker. A smirk or a nervous twitch. Reynolds wasn't sure. The latest forensic reports had thrown a wrench into the timeline. Bianca's gunshot wound was precise. Too precise for a supposed accident. The angle of entry suggested she had been sitting when she was shot, not standing as Larry had initially claimed. The spatter pattern contradicted his testimony entirely. If she had shot herself, as he insisted, the residue on her hands would have been different. The GSR test results had come back inconclusive. Not completely absent, but not consistent with self-infliction either. Then there was the insurance policy. A staggering amount. More than what most people would ever see in a lifetime. The ink was barely dry on the policy adjustments, finalized just weeks before Bianca's death. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Motive, means, opportunity. The three pillars of a murder case. Larry had all three, but what he needed was the irrefutable thread that tied them together. He glanced over at his partner, Detective Morales, who was meticulously reviewing phone records. "Anything?" Reynolds asked. Morales frowned, rubbing his temple. "Something odd." Larry's phone pinged off a tower nearly 40 miles from the hunting cabin hours before the body was discovered. If he was there when it happened, why was his phone so far away? A staged alibi. That's what it looked like. But staging an alibi required planning. Who was helping him? Or was he operating alone? The door swung open, and a uniformed officer stepped in, holding a small evidence bag. Inside was a dented shell casing recovered from the crime scene, sent in for further analysis. "The ballistics report just came in," the officer said, handing the file to Reynolds. He flipped it open, scanning the findings. His breath hitched. The bullet that killed Bianca matched a gun registered to Larry. But there was a problem. The weapon in question had not been recovered at the scene. "Then where the hell is the gun?" Morales muttered, as if reading Reynolds' thoughts. That question hung heavy in the air. Detective Reynolds stared at the ballistics report in his hands, his grip tightening around the folder. The weapon that had killed Bianca belonged to Larry, but it was missing. That fact alone unraveled the entire narrative Larry had so confidently provided. If Bianca had truly shot herself, the gun should have been right there with her body. But it wasn't, and that meant one thing. Someone had taken it. He exhaled sharply, his mind racing through the possibilities. If Larry had disposed of the weapon, where did he hide it? Had he given it to someone? Was there an accomplice they hadn't yet identified? His partner, Detective Morales, paced the length of the room, her brow furrowed in frustration. "We need to find that gun," she muttered. "If we can place it in Larry's possession after the shooting, that's it. We have him." Reynolds nodded, already forming a plan. "Let's go back through his movements that day. We know he left the hunting cabin. His phone was miles away when Bianca was found. If he got rid of the gun, it had to be somewhere along the way." Within minutes, they had Larry's known routes displayed on the screen, tracking his movements based on cell tower pings and surveillance footage. Most of the area was wilderness, dense forests, back roads, rivers, a million places to ditch a gun. Morales pointed to a stretch of highway. "There's a gas station here." He stopped for fuel after leaving the cabin. "If we can pull the security footage, maybe we can see if he got rid of anything." Reynolds was already dialing. It took some time, but within hours they were sitting in the back office of a dingy roadside gas station, watching grainy security footage. There he was. Larry Rudolph, stepping out of his black SUV. He moved with the casual ease of someone who didn't have a care in the world. But then, as the footage rolled forward, something caught Reynolds' attention. Larry walked toward a trash bin near the pump, glanced around, and then, in one swift motion, tossed something inside. It was small, metallic, something that glinted under the station's overhead lights. "Pause that," Reynolds said sharply. Morales froze the frame. Reynolds leaned in, his gut tightening. "That's it. That's our gun." Without another word, they were in the car, sirens blaring as they raced back to the gas station with a forensic team in tow. The bin had been emptied long ago, but trash from the station was transported to a nearby landfill. If the weapon was still out there, they had to find it. Hours later, under the searing heat of the Arizona sun, forensic technicians sifted through layers of waste, their gloved hands searching for a single damning piece of evidence. The stench was overwhelming, but Reynolds barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the scene before him, his breath held in anticipation. Then one of the technicians straightened, holding up a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a pistol, caked in grime but unmistakable. Reynolds felt the tension in his chest release. They had it, the missing weapon, the final piece of the puzzle. He turned to Morales, his expression grim but victorious. "Let's see Larry talk his way out of this one." Detective Reynolds sat across from Larry Rudolph in the small, windowless interrogation room, the silence stretching thick between them. The man's face was composed, his hands folded neatly on the table. If he was nervous, he didn't show it. But Reynolds had seen this type before. Men who thought they were too smart to get caught, too wealthy to face consequences. He slid the plastic evidence bag across the table, the weight of it landing with a dull thud. Inside, the recovered pistol gleamed beneath the fluorescent lighting, despite the dirt and grime from the landfill. Larry didn't move, but Reynolds caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. It was subtle, barely a hesitation, but it was there. "Found your gun," Reynolds said, keeping his voice even. "The one you reported missing." Funny thing, though. It was in a trash bin at a gas station, miles away from where Bianca died. Larry exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Detective, I have no idea how it got there. Maybe someone stole it. Maybe my wife had enemies. People knew we were in Africa. What if someone broke in while we were gone and took it?" Reynolds leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "And yet ballistics confirm it's the same gun that fired the bullet into Bianca's heart." He let the words hang in the air, watching as Larry's expression remained eerily calm. "Then someone set me up," Larry said smoothly, his voice never rising, never breaking. "Because I told you, I was in another room when it happened. I didn't touch that gun. I love my wife. Loved her enough to cash in a $5 million life insurance policy right after she died," Morales interjected, stepping forward. She dropped a thick folder onto the table, opening it to reveal financial records. "This is a detailed breakdown of every payout, every claim, every email you sent regarding her insurance policies. You made sure everything was in order before she even left the country. Hell, you increased her coverage just months before she died. Now, why would a loving husband do that?" Larry sighed, rubbing his forehead as if exhausted by the incompetence of the people questioning him. "I run a successful dental practice. I know how finances work. It's common sense to be prepared. If something happened to me, I'd want Bianca to be taken care of." "Right," Reynolds said, his voice tight with skepticism. "But she never got the chance, did she? Because she's dead. And instead of mourning, you were wiring money to your girlfriend back in the U.S. 2 days after Bianca's death, Larry. 2 days. That doesn't exactly scream grief-stricken widower, does it?" For the first time, Larry's mask cracked, just slightly. A twitch at the corner of his mouth, a sharp inhale. "You went to great lengths to make it look like an accident," Morales continued, flipping another page. "Even sent emails to the travel insurance company within hours of Bianca's death, pushing for a payout. That's not normal behavior, Larry. That's the behavior of a man who knew exactly what was going to happen." Larry leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He was smart. He knew they had evidence, but they didn't have everything. He wouldn't break, at least, not yet. "I don't know what you want me to say," he finally said, spreading his hands. "I didn't kill my wife. Whatever story you're building, it's wrong. Bianca's death was a tragedy. That's all it was." Reynolds studied him for a long moment before standing. "We'll see," he said simply. "But you should know, people like you always make one mistake, and when we find it, you're done." Larry didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. As Reynolds and Morales walked out, shutting the door behind them, they knew one thing for certain. They weren't done yet, not even close. Detective Reynolds sat at his desk, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm against the pile of evidence stacked in front of him. The case against Larry Rudolph was building, piece by piece, but they needed more, something undeniable, something that would break his carefully crafted facade. Across the room, Morales was on the phone with an FBI financial analyst. Her voice was clipped, professional, but there was a note of triumph in her tone. She hung up and turned to Reynolds, her eyes gleaming. "We got something." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Tell me." Morales grabbed a file and walked over. "That offshore account we flagged? Turns out Larry's been funneling money into it for years, long before Bianca's death. And guess who's been withdrawing from it?" She slid a photograph across the desk. It was a grainy surveillance image, but the woman's face was unmistakable. Lori Maliron, Larry's longtime mistress, the woman who had spent over a decade waiting in the shadows while he remained publicly married to Bianca. The same woman who, according to multiple witnesses, had been openly discussing a future with Larry, one that conveniently excluded Bianca. Reynolds exhaled. So he wasn't just planning a future with her. He was financially preparing for it. Morales nodded. "It gets better. The payments increased significantly in the months leading up to Bianca's death. And the kicker? The day after Bianca was shot, Larry wired Lori $30,000. 2 weeks later, he transferred another $100,000. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his mind piecing together the puzzle. He didn't just want Bianca gone, he wanted to make sure Lori stayed happy. He was securing his new life before his old one was even cold in the ground. Morales crossed her arms. And Lori's not just some innocent bystander in this. She knew. She had to. Reynolds nodded. Time to bring her in. Lori Maliron arrived at the station wearing oversized sunglasses and a crisp white blouse, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. She sat in the interrogation room with her arms crossed, a mask of indifference on her face. But Reynolds could see through it. He took a seat across from her, placing a thick folder between them. Ms. Millerin, let's cut to the chase. We know about the money. We know about the emails. We know that Larry was planning a future with you. She didn't flinch. So what? That's not a crime. Reynolds smiled, but there was no warmth in it. No, it's not. But murder is. Lori's jaw tightened just slightly. You knew Bianca was going to die, didn't you? Morales pressed, leaning forward. You were already making plans. Hell, you were practically picking out furniture for the new house before her body was even cold. That's ridiculous, Lori snapped. Larry and I had a relationship, yes, but that doesn't mean I knew anything about what happened in Africa. Reynolds flipped open the file, revealing printed transcripts of emails exchanged between her and Larry in the weeks before Bianca's death. So when you told him, I'm tired of being the girlfriend, I want to be the wife, that wasn't a push for him to finally get rid of Bianca? Lori's eyes flickered across the words, her fingers curling into her lap. That's not what I meant. And when he responded, I have a plan, just trust me. What exactly was that plan? Lori opened her mouth, then shut it. Reynolds leaned in, lowering his voice. Larry's a smart man. He thinks he's untouchable. But you're disposable. The minute he's backed into a corner, who do you think he's going to throw under the bus? Lori swallowed. This is your chance, Morales said softly. You tell us the truth, and maybe, just maybe, you don't go down with him. A long silence stretched between them. Then finally Lori exhaled, her shoulders sagging. I didn't know all the details, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I knew something was going to happen. Reynolds exchanged a glance with Morales. They had her. The moment Lori began talking, the case against Larry Rudolph became undeniable. She provided details that only someone with inside knowledge would know. The heated arguments between Larry and Bianca, his growing frustration with their marriage, his repeated statements that divorce was not an option because it would cost too much. She spoke of the way Larry had reassured her in the months before Bianca's death, how he had promised they would be together soon. She admitted that she had questioned him after Bianca was shot, but he had silenced her with money, with vacations, with the promise of a future free from scandal. Reynolds listened, taking meticulous notes. Every word Lori said brought them closer to locking Larry Rudolph away for good. When the interrogation ended, Morales stood, nodding at Reynolds. We've got enough. It's time. Reynolds didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and dialed. Let's bring him in. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed in, their expressions unreadable. Larry Rudolph sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his usually confident demeanor faltering. Beside him, his legal team whispered final words of reassurance, but it was clear, even they sensed the inevitable. On the other side of the room, Bianca Rudolph's family held their breath. They had waited years for this moment, for justice to be served. The judge turned to the jury foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, an older man with graying hair, stood. We have, Your Honor. Larry's fingers twitched against the table. In the matter of the state versus Lawrence Rudolph, on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. A collective exhale rippled through the room. Bianca's loved ones clutched each other, tears streaming down their faces, not in sorrow but in relief. Larry's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His downfall had been slow, methodical, built on the weight of greed, deception, and a belief that he was untouchable. But in the end, the truth had caught up to him. The judge's voice was firm. Dr. Lawrence Rudolph. This court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck. It was over. As the news of Larry Rudolph's conviction spread, it became more than just another headline. It was a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition, about the dangers of entitlement, and about the price of betrayal. Bianca had been a loving wife, a woman who had spent years by Larry's side, never knowing the depth of his deceit. Her story was a reminder that evil does not always come in obvious forms. Sometimes it wears the face of a trusted partner. For Lori Maliron, the consequences were swift. Though she had not pulled the trigger, her complicity had sealed her fate. She, too, faced prison time for her role in aiding and abetting Larry's cover-up. The case also highlighted the persistence of justice. It took years for investigators to uncover the truth, but they never gave up. Their determination ensured that Bianca Rudolph did not become just another statistic. In the end, Larry Rudolph had spent his life chasing wealth, power, and control. But none of it mattered as he sat alone in a prison cell, stripped of the lavish life he had so desperately tried to preserve. Justice had prevailed, and Bianca Rudolph's story would not be forgotten. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.